Welcome back, everyone, to the Deep Dive,
Yeah.
where we like to get into the nitty-gritty. And today we are taking a look at something that I think a lot of you are really interested in, and that is how women are being represented in fiction.
Yeah.
We have a transcript from a YouTube video that was flagged for us.
Right.
And it takes a really critical look at some of the norms that are going on right now with like so-called strong female characters.
Yeah.
So we are going to dive in today and analyze this YouTuber who is known as the Authentic Observer.
Yes, the Authentic Observer.
Okay.
And yeah, they really take a hard look at this kind of like this badass chick trope that is very popular in fiction these days.
Yeah.
And ask whether it's really empowering.
Right.
And they also look at how this impacts how male characters are being depicted in fiction as well. So
okay.
Yeah, we're going to try to unpack all of that.
All right. So this YouTuber kind of sets the scene by first talking about two types of female characters that they say kind of miss the mark.
Right.
And the first one is this idea of the wet lettuce. Now, for those who haven't heard that term before.
Right.
What is that?
So, the damsel in distress.
Uh-huh.
We all know the damsel in distress.
Right.
This is like the damsel in distress on steroids.
Okay.
So think Bella Swan from Twilight.
Okay.
The YouTuber actually mentions Bella's, potential for extreme dependence on Edward, like her well-being, depending entirely on whether or not she's with her boyfriend.
You're right.
So, they're passive, they lack drive.
They have no agency of their own.
They have no agency of their own.
Yeah.
And, they only really seem to exist in relation to a male love interest.
Okay.
So
not really empowering.
Not really empowering? No.
Not really.
It really kind of paints a picture of femininity as victimhood.
Okay, so it sounds like the wet lettuce archetype is not really like the main target here. It's more of a widely recognized.
Yeah, it's widely acknowledged as a poor representation.
Right.
So they touch on that, but they quickly move on to what they see as like the more pervasive and kind of more damaging trend in contemporary fiction.
Right.
And that is this rise of the badass chick.
Okay.
And this is often presented as the antidote to the wet lettuce.
Right.
So like we needed something
to push back
against that.
Right.
And so we got the badass chick.
Okay, so how does the YouTuber define these badass chicks? What are they like?
Well, they're typically, highly driven, unemotional, physically formidable.
Uh-huh.
They're often depicted as being able to like overpower male opponents.
Right.
Who might be significantly larger than them.
Much bigger.
Yeah, much bigger.
Okay.
And so the core question that the Authentic Observer asks is this image of a physically dominant, unemotional woman, is this really an empowering figure for young women to look up to?
Right.
And their conclusion is no.
It's not.
It's not.
And this is where I think things get really interesting because the YouTuber goes on to make this really kind of provocative suggestion.
Right.
And it is that the badass chick often achieves this level of strength and capability by adopting what they see as like traditionally masculine traits.
Yeah.
So how does this actually undermine true femininity in the YouTubers?
Well, their argument basically is that by, emphasizing the physical strength to this extent and suppressing emotion, that it inadvertently sends this message that traditional feminine qualities are weak.
All right.
So it's like in order for a woman to be strong,
yeah,
a female character to be strong, she has to be like a man.
Okay.
And so they see that as kind of devaluing femininity in itself.
And this leads into this point where biology gets brought into the whole discussion.
Right.
So the YouTuber actually, names specific biological differences between men and women to challenge this idea of these like hyper strong female characters.
Yeah.
Like how believable is it?
Right.
Can you walk us through some of their points?
Sure. So they mentioned that, men generally have larger hearts and lung capacity, which translates to greater endurance and energy levels.
Right.
They also refer to, studies that indicate significant differences in upper body strength.
Great.
For example, one study suggested that women have, on average, about 40% less upper body strength than men.
Wow.
And another study found that, 90% of women scored lower in grip strength than 95% of men.
Wow.
And so, they kind of use this to question, the believability of female characters, effortlessly overpowering these much larger male opponents.
Yeah.
And, they say this is more fantasy than a realistic portrayal of strength.
Right. It's not that women can't be strong or capable, but this is sort of superhuman level stuff.
It's like defying the laws of physics a little bit.
Yeah.
Yeah, and they also point to men's broader shoulders, which can offer a mechanical advantage in fighting. And also higher testosterone levels.
Okay.
Which lead to greater muscle mass and bone density in men.
Right.
They also touch on potential differences in spatial awareness and assertiveness. And they even reference a study that showed that male Marines performed better.
Right.
In combat.
So again, it seems like their frustration really comes from this feeling that it's not authentic, and it almost does a disservice to women by suggesting that true strength is this.
Yeah, you have to mimic
masculine physical attributes.
Masculine physical attributes, that's exactly right.
Yeah.
And so, it kind of implies that femininity is inherently weaker.
Right.
And that these depictions are almost like a form of tokenism.
Right. Yeah.
And this leads into their next big argument, which is that to make the badass chick, work, they often have to undermine the male characters.
Okay, so this is another really interesting and perhaps more controversial element.
Right.
So how does the YouTuber believe this is happening? How are these male characters being treated in order to prop up these female characters?
So they argue that to make these female characters, seem so powerful.
Yeah.
They're often making the male characters look incompetent or diminishing them or just pushing them aside.
Okay.
And they actually give several examples from popular books and films to illustrate this.
Let's get into some specifics.
Yeah.
The YouTuber specifically mentions Ron Weasley.
Yes.
From the Harry Potter movies.
Right.
What is their problem with his portrayal?
Well, their point is that Ron, who is, a very multifaceted character in the books and a courageous character.
Right.
Is often reduced to just comic relief in the movies.
Okay.
And more importantly, some of his best moments of, intelligence and bravery and even some of his key lines are given to Hermione.
Oh, really?
In the films.
Wow.
So basically, they're diminishing Ron's agency.
Okay.
And making Hermione seem, superior by comparison.
So it's not a one-to-one adaptation in terms of those character dynamics?
No, it's not.
Interesting.
And the specific instance that they highlight is that powerful moment in Prisoner of Azkaban where Ron, despite having a broken leg, stands up to protect Harry and Hermione and says, if you want to kill Harry, you'll have to kill us too.
Right.
And in the movie, Hermione says that line.
Oh, wow.
And so, that just kind of subtly reinforces the idea that female characters have to take on these traditionally heroic male traits to be effective.
Interesting.
Yeah.
What other examples?
So they also mention instances in Doctor Who.
Okay.
Where, the male character, particularly the Doctor and Robin Hood in one episode, are portrayed as, kind of like competitive, silly little boys who are kind of like messing everything up.
Right.
Whereas the female companion, Clara, is the sensible and mature one.
Okay.
And the authentic observer kind of points to a potential double standard here. They say, you wouldn't really see female characters being made to look foolish.
Right.
In stereotypically feminine ways.
Yeah.
While the male characters rolling their eyes.
Right. Right.
And so they also take issue with a moment in Doctor Who following a male-to-female regeneration.
Okay.
Where there's a comment about the previous male incarnation's ego. And they say this is cheap and politically charged.
Right.
So their concern is that, often masculine characters are either villainized, or if they're good, they're shown as weak or ineffective.
Okay.
And so they see that as like an underlying fear
right.
of depicting competent masculinity.
Okay. However, they do offer some contrasting examples, right?
Right.
Where they say, okay, here are some characters who are masculine and positive,
right?
And don't fit this pattern of being diminished.
Yeah.
So who do they point to?
So they point to Rick Grimes from The Walking Dead.
Okay.
As a strong and decisive leader who is also loyal and brave and compassionate.
Okay.
They also highlight Lee Scoresby from his Dark Materials.
Okay.
As a tough, confident, intelligent, adventurous, and fiercely protective character who they also describe as a sweetheart.
Oh, okay.
And then finally they mention Aragorn.
Yes.
From The Lord of the Rings.
Right.
As wise, fatherly, decisive, disciplined, authoritative, and self-sacrificing.
So all these traditionally masculine traits, but combined with a lot of positive qualities?
Positive qualities, exactly.
Yeah.
So, it's not that they're saying that all male characters are weak or villainous.
Right.
But that there is a trend of undermining them to elevate female characters.
And that this is not true equality.
That's for true equality, no.
Right.
And then they single out one book, Daughter of the Pirate King, as being especially problematic.
What happens in that?
Well, the male characters are basically either bumbling and incompetent idiots or savage and villainous brutes.
So they're all pretty one-dimensional.
Yeah. Okay. Which, makes both the male and the female characters less believable and less interesting.
Right, because they're not playing off of full characters.
Exactly.
Okay, so now this leads into this other element, which is the importance of femininity and vulnerability.
Yes.
So how do they define true female strength as opposed to this kind of badass chick persona?
So they believe that genuine female strength doesn't actually require a rejection of femininity.
Okay.
Or the adoption of masculine trait. So they contrast the kind of emotionally stunted and superficially feminine badass chick. And they give the example of Selena Sardothian from Throne of Glass.
Okay.
As an example of a character who's very physically capable,
right,
but is often lacking emotional depth, and kind of embodies a pretty narrow view of femininity.
Okay.
And so they contrast that with characters who successfully integrate strength, authentic femininity.
And vulnerability actually seems to be like a key element for them.
It is.
Of this idea of true strength.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
So they argue that vulnerability is not a weakness, but rather, a crucial aspect of human experience.
Yeah.
And actually a very important source of strength, particularly within femininity.
Interesting.
And they highlight Lyra Belacqua from his Dark Materials.
Yeah.
As the prime example.
Okay.
Lyra is incredibly intelligent and courageous.
Right.
But they point out that her, deep compassion and empathy and her willingness to be vulnerable are actually her most powerful attributes.
Wow.
And that drives her action.
Yeah.
And makes her a truly strong character.
So it's like flipping the script.
Yeah.
On this idea of being tough and strong.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Meaning unemotional and not vulnerable.
Yeah, like a closed off.
Yeah.
Unfeeling kind of person.
Yeah.
And so they also mentioned Vianne Roche from Chocolat.
Yeah.
Whose strength lies in her warmth and humor and her nurturing nature and deep understanding of others.
Right. So they're not using violence as a demonstration of strength. It's these other things.
These other qualities. Exactly. Yeah. And they also contrast Selena's often destructive tendencies with Ellen Carr.
Okay.
From A Song for Summer.
Right.
Whose strength lies in, nurturing and creative and life-affirming actions. And she fully embraces her maternal side.
So the YouTuber's essentially questioning this idea of why violence is so often glorified as a sign of female empowerment.
Yeah.
Especially when these violent traits are often what we would call toxic masculinity.
Exactly. Yeah.
In male characters.
Yeah. Like, why do we applaud a female assassin?
Right.
Like Selena, for things that we would criticize in a male character.
Right. It's a double standard.
It is a double standard, yeah.
Okay.
And they also point to Lady Macbeth as a really interesting example.
Interesting.
Of a powerful and memorable female character who, achieved your ambitious goals through cunning and manipulation and psychological strength rather than fighting skills.
Right.
And
nobody would say she's not a strong character.
Nobody would say she's not a strong character.
No.
And they also reiterate that both positive masculine traits, things like focus and discipline and stability and generosity and positive feminine traits, like vulnerability and understanding and the nurturing and cooperation, they all hold inherent value and contribute to a well-rounded and strong person. Exactly.
Yeah.
And then they also mention the backlash that happens after Black Widow expressed sadness at not being able to have children in Avengers, Age of Ultron.
Right.
And they say this kind of highlights, our societal discomfort with portraying traditionally feminine desires as anything other than a weakness.
Right. Yeah, so it sounds like this YouTuber is really advocating for a more balanced and respectful way of portraying both genders in fiction. Yeah. Acknowledging their differences without resorting to this antagonism or the need to diminish one to uplift the other.
Exactly. They're frustrated with what they call like a war between the genders.
Right.
That we see so much of.
In fiction and in real life.
In fiction and in real life.
Yeah.
Yes. And they're really advocating for complementarity rather than this constant opposition. Yeah. They want to make it clear that they're not arguing for a return to these like rigid traditional gender roles.
Right.
But they are pushing back against this idea that women must adopt masculine traits to be considered equal or strong.
Right.
And also against the shaming of femininity is weak and masculinity is toxic.
Right.
So it's really about respecting both.
Yeah.
And not putting one above the other.
Right. So what would you say is like the core takeaway here?
The core takeaway, I think, is that true female empowerment.
Yeah.
In fiction and perhaps beyond.
Right.
Is not about mimicking masculinity.
Yeah.
Or disempowering male characters.
Okay.
But about recognizing and celebrating and valuing, diverse spectrum of strengths.
Right.
Including those that have been traditionally associated with femininity.
Yeah.
Right.
So not just violence.
Not just physical strength or violence.
No, and the ability to like overpower other people. Right. It's so much more than that.
It's so much more than that, yeah.
Okay.
And they also worry that this trend of shaming either femininity or masculinity can lead to really unhealthy and negative expressions of these inherent aspects of identity.
Yeah.
And that really, a healthy balance and a mutual respect between the two is absolutely essential for genuine progress.
I think this has been a really insightful deep dive into this critique of gender representation in fiction.
Absolutely.
It definitely gives us a lot to think about when we encounter these tropes in books and movies and other media.
It does, yeah.
And it leads to this really important question for all of you to consider, and that is, how does this perspective from the authentic observer change the way that you understand these strong female characters that you encounter?
Right.
Does it make you reconsider which traits we celebrate as empowering and for whom?
Yeah.
Maybe it encourages us to think more deeply about the balance between celebrating strength in all its forms and really acknowledging the richness and complexity of both feminine and masculine qualities.
Absolutely.
In storytelling and in life.
Yes.
So that's something to think about.
It is.
Thanks for joining us for this deep dive.
Yes, thank you.
We'll see you next time.
See you later.